Hey, what up squad, it's your boy K-Flow, and in this video I'm going to show you how to replace the front wheel bearing on the Toyota Tacoma. Let's get this thing started. If you're new to this channel makes in-depth DIY tutorials for the second gen Toyota Tacoma. So make sure you smash that like, subscribe, and hit that bell too, baby. Do it now, guys. All the materials and tools that I use in this video will be on my Amazon page, so make sure you check that out at amazon.kflow-crib.com. And this is an affiliate link. If you guys purchase from my links, it actually really helps the channel out, so please do so. Real quick guys, I want to give a big shout out to Diego Martinez. Thank you so much for the very generous beer donation. You're the man, dude. Thank you so much again. And for today, we're going to be drinking this Grand Cacao Chocolate Stout. Crack this thing open. Cheers everybody. Oh man, that's good. So make sure you guys give him a follow and like all his photos too while you're at it. Again, thanks so much, Diego. Now let's get to the garage.
Alrighty guys, so it looks like we got ourselves a bad wheel bearing. Check out that play. Pushing the top of the tire here. So that probably occurred from the wheeling that I did in Florida, as well as an overall Florida trip, because that was about 4,000 miles round trip. And I guess now it's about time to replace her. I'm gonna get worse wear, and it's really bad for the tire. So we've taken off the wheel and the spacers, guys. The spacers right there. Now we'll have to take off this brake caliper. This brake caliper has a 12mm bolt right there that we'll take off, and there's two 17mm bolts on the caliper itself. So let's undo those right now. So we'll make this easier on ourselves, guys, by turning the wheel so that we can have better exposure to this caliper. So here's the setup, guys. Currently we have the caliper hanging off the top of the suspension system using some bungees, because we definitely don't want to tension any of the brake lines or even the ABS cable that's connected to that. So now we'll have to take this brake rotor off, and as you can see, she's a little bit seized on there, so we're going to be using the proper tool to remove it, which is basically like a screw that drives into these holes that breaks it loose from the inside. So we'll do that now. So it looks like my tool, someone has destroyed it. I lent it to somebody, but at this point I will just use a 2x4 on the opposite side and then hammer it outwards. This should break any of the rust loose off of this rotor. Easy peasy, guys. So now let's get this hub cover off, and I'll be using a cold chisel to slowly pry it around the outside of this so this thing comes off real easy. So now we can take off this cotter pin and this retaining cap here, and that allows us to at least free up this nut here in the back. So now let's just brush all the crud off of the thread here on the CV axle, so this thing can come off real easy without seizing up on us. We can also hit the surfaces here with some PB blaster. Now I have placed a jack stand here on one of the studs to prevent this whole thing from turning when I'm trying to remove that nut off of the CV axle. So now let's use a 35mm socket to remove this nut, and first I'm going to try it with the impact wrench. Very nice, guys. That didn't take too much effort. But if that was tough and you're having a hard time due to the nut being seized on there, here's a quick tip, and I'll roll that right now.
I first tried using a breaker bar and an extension to remove this nut, but it was really not working. So now it was time to use the big guns.
Say hello to my little friend!
I took my MAP gas torch and torched the hell out of that nut. Finally, the breaker bar and the extension worked. And now we can remove that 35mm nut completely.
So now we'll take a socket just a little bit smaller than the diameter of the CV axle threads here, and just hammer in the CV axle so that it breaks loose from the spline on that wheel bearing assembly. As you can see, now that's completely free. So now the only thing left will be to remove the 4 bolts holding this wheel bearing in place before we have to break this thing loose. So these bolts, they're 17mm bolts, and we'll use a closed end of a wrench and a hammer to break them loose. Alright guys, so that's pretty much all we can do in terms of removing these bolts. We'll just back them out as far as we can. So we'll also have to remove this ABS sensor using a 10mm socket.
So at this point in the video guys, I'll be showing you 2 methods on removing the hub assembly. This first method is on the driver's side, and as you can see, the seal behind the hub assembly pretty much tore, and water and mud got in between there and pretty much corroded the mating surfaces between the spindle and the hub assembly. So this thing was pretty seized on there. So you'll see I will be using a specialized tool to break that hub assembly loose so it can be removed from the spindle.
Alright guys, so now the wheel bearing is pretty much completely free, but it will be a little bit of work to remove it completely from the spindle. So to aid in the removal, we'll be using this tool here. We basically will mount this onto the hub assembly and then hammer on this side using this sledgehammer to break the hub pretty much loose. So I'll show you how we do that now. so it was able to break it loose a little bit. So now I'm going to use a hammer and hammer right here to break it loose completely. I'm going to be using my 5-pound hand sledge to make it easier on myself. So she's on there real tight, guys. I'm going to use this cold chisel and just hammer it all the way around to further loosen it. Working the cold chisel around actually loosened it up real nicely. So there's the old wheel bearing. Just a quick note here on the wheel bearing removal tool. So as you can see, this is the tool right up against the studs. If we take a look at the studs, we're really only grabbing maybe 3 or 4 threads on there. So what happened when I removed it, the original nuts that I had mounted on here ended up stripping. So it's good to always have extra nuts when you do this. As you can see, this was the shoulder nuts. And you can see that the inside threads there are pretty much pulled out. So I did end up buying extra nuts from McMaster. So you can see here, just in case I needed any more. Since the studs are only biting about 3 to 4 threads on the nut, you can probably pound it maybe about 3 to 4 times before the threads start stripping out. And there's the inside of that spindle. I am going to also need to replace that ABS sensor, as it also broke when I was attempting to replace it. So now I'll remove this seal here and clean up all of these surfaces on the spindle. And I'll be using a brake cleaner to clean all that out nice and good. There it is, guys. That seal is completely off. So here, I did turn the wheel all the way to the passenger side, and we'll have to loosen the upper control arm and the sway bar so that we can remove the seal completely off of the spindle and off of that axle. So I have an aftermarket sway bar, and this is an 18mm socket. This upper control arm is also aftermarket, and this is a 22mm socket. Now before taking this off completely, let's see if we could knock this ball joint loose by taking a hammer and hammering this part of the spindle. Alright guys, so it looks like we still don't have enough swing out from the spindle. Therefore, we'll also have to take off this tie rod. And this is also aftermarket. And this is a 21mm socket. Fortunately, that one wasn't seized up on the spindle, so I don't have to use a pickle fork or any other specialty tools to knock that one loose. Now I did remove this ABS cable tied down onto this part of the spindle, so the spindle is pretty much free at this point, as you can see. And we can now remove this seal and clean up that inner portion of the spindle.
Now this is the second method for removing the hub assembly, and as you can see, the seal held up and it didn't let water go through, so it was much easier to remove this with just a hammer.
So for this side, guys, I'm gonna try just using a sledgehammer to see if we could break it loose. And that wasn't too bad. It looks like that did break it loose. You might not even have to use that wheel bearing tool. So with this side, guys, I'll try to remove the lower control arm instead. So we'll see if that's easier than the other method that I did. Yeah, I think that was definitely much easier, guys. So if you're gonna do this, just remove the two lower control arm bolts. Now we can also clean up all the mating surfaces on the outside of this front drive shaft. We'll have to use a rag with a brake cleaner on the rag so we don't get any of the rubber pieces, like this part, getting damaged by the brake cleaner. Now let's coat this surface and this surface with some anti-seize. This is where the wheel bearing rides on, and this is where the seal rides on. So let's do that now. So I did paint all these bearing surfaces, guys. This way, it makes it easier to pull off that wheel bearing, just in case we need to remove it again in the future. So now let's hammer in the new seal at the back. Now we can put on some wheel bearing grease on the inner side of the seal here, and on the outside of this shaft here. So now we could partially reassemble the spindle, starting with inserting the drive shaft into the spindle and then putting the upper control arm to the upper part of the spindle and then the tie rod. And last but not least, the sway bar too. Now we may have to jack the lower control arm to get the upper control arm to close on it. Now to get a little bit more leverage, I'm going to be using a ratchet strap to pull that upper control arm down to the lower control arm. And I'm going to be using a 22mm socket to tighten down, only hand tight for now. And this one is a 21mm socket. And this one is an 18mm socket. Alright guys, so here's the axle. Let's put some anti-seize on the splines of this too, so it doesn't seize up on the new wheel bearing. Here's the new wheel bearing, guys. I did put some anti-seize on this surface here, so that it doesn't seize up against the dust shield. The dust shield, I actually just ended up brushing off all the scaling and hitting it with some spray paint to protect it from rusting further. A new one of these is like 140 bucks, and it's definitely not worth it, especially if this one still is in relatively good shape as it is, just has a little bit of scaling. So I'm going to put this onto this, and this whole thing will go onto that. I just want to point out, guys, that this does have an O-ring, as you can see right there, that goes around the wheel hub assembly. So make sure that's installed on there too. Now we will have to go around and crisscross when we're tightening this down, so this whole thing closes on the spindle in a very flat manner. Also, these bolts already do have Loctite on them. So now that the wheel bearings pretty much flattened up against the spindle, I'm going to use the wrench to close the end and then just knock it a little bit tighter with a hammer, because we can't really get a torque wrench right on there. So I'm just gonna knock it with a hammer and the wrench just lightly, so that until it feels like it's not gonna back out. Alright guys, now we could install that big ass nut, that 35mm nut, and torque it down to 173 foot-pounds. I do have a jack stand here with a rubber jack pad to protect this thread as I'm rotating this clockwise in order to tighten down that nut. So now we can put the locking ring and the cotter pin back onto that CV axle. Now it's almost done, guys. Man, doesn't that look beautiful? Beautiful. So now at this point, I'm going to be painting the flat surfaces here with some anti-seize along with the inner surface there where the hub cover goes on. In my case, since I have wheel spacers, I am going to be using Loctite reds on the studs. But if you don't have wheel spacers, you can just go ahead and install it with anti-seize on there. Now we can put the rotor back on. So now I'm gonna tap in the hub cover using a rubber mallet. As I mentioned, since I have wheel spacers, I'm going to be using thread locker. I won't be torquing these down yet until I have the brake caliper back on, so I'm going to do that now. Now I do make sure that there's blue Loctite on those bolts for the caliper before I install them. Now I'm going to tighten down that wheel spacer and torque it down to 95 foot-pounds. And in order to lock that rotor in place, I'm going to jam a flathead screwdriver down the middle of the rotor in order to keep this from rotating as I torque it down. Now let's reinstall this brake line bracket with this bolt using a 12mm socket. And this we tighten down to 15 foot-pounds. And we can also reroute the ABS line as well as reinstalled the ABS sensor using a 10mm socket. That upper control arm bolt, that's a 22mm bolt that we tightened down to 81 foot-pounds. This sway bar end link, it's an 18mm nut, and that's tightened down to 41 foot-pounds. And this tie rod is a 21mm nut torqued down to 41 foot-pounds. Don't forget to put the cotter pin back onto that tie rod as well. And the last thing to do would be to reinstall the wheels and torque it down to 85 foot-pounds.
Now if you're reinstalling the lower control arm, those are 19mm bolts torqued down to 118 foot-pounds. There's a little bit of a technique in terms of reinstalling that lower control arm, and I'm not going to go over that in this video because I have a full-blown video tutorial on removal and reinstallation of the lower control arm. So make sure you watch that on this channel too. So that's pretty much all I got for this video, guys. I hope it really helped you out. If you haven't yet, make sure you smash that like, subscribe, and hit that bell too while you're at it. Until next time, peace.